Chapter 11. "How pleasant that you could join us," the hook-handed man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the road, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her up into the tower room, and with the flick of his hook, he sent her rescue device clanking to the ground. Now Violet was as trapped as her sister. "I'm so glad you're here," the hook-handed man said. "I was just thinking how much I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat." "What are you going to do with me?" Violet asked. "I said, have a seat." The hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into a chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. "I am certain that over the course of your own life, you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I can play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph taken a very long time ago of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that were very precious and dear to me." The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf. And they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas in illegible scrawl, lying in messy piles on top of the copy of Nuptial Law he had taken away from Klaus. There were a few chairs and handful of candles which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor were empty bottles and dirty dishes. But most of all, there were drawings and paintings and carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceilings, scratched into the grimy wooden floors. There were even eyes scrawled along the windowsill, and one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed the button and waited one moment. "Boss, it's me," he said. "Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try and rescue the little biting brat." He paused as Count Olaf said something. "I don't know. With some sort of rope?" "It was a grappling hook," Violet said, and tore off the sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. "I made it myself." "She says it's a grappling hook," the hook-handed man said into the walkie-talkie. "I don't know, boss." "Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Of course. I understand. She's yours." "Yes, boss." He pressed a button to disconnect the line and then turned to face Violet. "Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride." "I'm not his bride," Violet said bitterly. "Very soon you will be," the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook the way most people would wag a finger. "In the meantime, however, I have to go and fetch your brother. However, the three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way, Count Olaf can be sure you will stay out of his mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stomped out the room. Violet heard the doors lock behind him, and then listened to his footsteps fading down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister for fear of Count Olaf, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything was all right. But, of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died, suddenly and horribly. Mr. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's home and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them, and they had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire's fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge that he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library, and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. Do you think that Violet should have tried to capture her sister, or do you think that she should have just waited until the marriage or the play? Leave it in the comments. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophic after catastrophic events, and Violet found their situation deplorable. A phrase here which means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of the footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's up so high," he said. "You must have been terrified." "I was very scared," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught, and now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'd keep us here until tonight, and then it's the marvelous marriage." "Do you think I could invent something that would help us escape? Or do you think that you could invent something to help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said. "And why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that could be of use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room and their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects in which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her on the head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in all their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, I could make I don't know how to say this word, Molotov cocktail with these bottles." "What is that?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract the attention of a passerby." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamous," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. Polygamists are people who marry more than one person. In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge, with the statement of "I do" and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in nuptial law. "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives. But I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said. "But I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped off the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and then the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrows had been waxed so they looked shiny as new. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved the hook at the youngster. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associates here will stay behind in this room, and we will keep in constant contact through walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then at Sunny, still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as his hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out to her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door and the short walk down the block to the theater, Violet thought and thought and thought harder than she ever had in her whole entire life. Why do you think that she's looking at her hand? Why does her right hand have to be so important? Why does she need to think about that? Leave a comment down below with your thoughts. If you know, you've already read the book, watched the movie, watched the series, don't spoil it.